So for the first place, we are going to Professor Robert Beckford, a leading British theologian, broadcaster, and filmmaker known for his work on black theology, social justice, and climate ethics. He's a BAFTA-winning documentarian and has produced over 20 films exploring race, religion, and empire. Over to you, Professor Beckford.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everybody. I am institutionalized as a university academic, so I have to use a PowerPoint, or else I feel very insecure. So I'm using a PowerPoint. I'm going to work through 6 questions that Rhea so kindly provided us with, and hopefully provide some questions for us to engage with as we go along. This is a Sankofa approach, partly because I'm old, but partly because I remember that Sankofa means you look backwards in order to go forward. So I'm going to try and provide some historical context to some of the issues and concerns that we're going to be discussing this evening. One of the, there we go. No, it isn't going there. Let's try that way. There you go. The first question that we're asked to consider is issues around structure. What kind of structural barriers still persist in the present? Well, I want us to think about the way in which immigration still remains as a major structural barrier that inhibits our capacity to talk about race in a meaningful way, because we still haven't separated race from nation. We know that every single immigration policy made from 1962 through to the present, I stopped at 1981 because I thought some folk might want to do the modern stuff, is highly racialized, and it folds race into nation, so that to be British means to be white. It remains a structural barrier today. Whoops, need to go the right way, there you go. It remains a structural barrier because we're talking about new immigration policies, all of which have been described as being highly racialized, highly problematic. So we've got to think about the structural barriers. I'm thinking about immigration. Other folk may talk about other structures that still influence us. Why is this happening? Well, the three-brain genius that is Paul Gilroy said it's because we're still using liberal ideas. Inside of liberalism, race is not deconstructed. The liberal pact from the 19th century through to the present did not include black and brown bodies. So we have to find alternative structures, systems, and processes, concepts for thinking about race, justice, and immigration as a feature of that. I'm going to try and use as many Brummies as I can going forward, actually. I really struggled, but I'm going to throw a few Jamaicans in terms of expertise. The other question that we're asked to consider is the evolution of racism. Look, again, I want to go back and think about something that wasn't happening when I was growing up, but that is happening now. I'm going to hopefully, Dave Chappelle will help us get there, hopefully.
For the last 15 years, a man named Clayton Bigsby has been the leading voice of the white supremacist movement in America. Though not sold in any major bookstores, despite his popularity, very few have ever seen him due to his reclusiveness. But in an effort to bring his message to a wider audience, he agreed to give his first public interview ever to Frontline. But not sure we're in the right place. We're looking for Clayton Bigsby.
Well, look no further, fella, you found me.
Clayton Bigsby, the author?
What, you don't think I can write them books? Just because I'm blind don't mean I'm dumb.
How could this have happened? A black white supremacist.
Look, we know that racialized oppression is dynamic, multiple, complex, changes over time, is inherently profane. But one of the things that I think is interesting today is the breakdown of the consensus amongst black people racialized as black in terms of where they stand politically. We now have the emergence of a black far right. And I know because I work in religion. Many of the churches, mega churches in Britain of African heritage, some of Caribbean heritage, who have been informed by right-wing Christianity for at least 3 decades, primarily through technologized media, have now moved into this position. So when we're talking about the evolution of racism, we now have to take into consideration the fact that there's a fragmentation of black perspectives on what it means to be black, what it means to fight against racism, and how we actually go about the business of challenging the structural injustice that impacts on us. Obviously, again, this issue isn't new. Using Sankofa, you can go back to the 1980s, the emergence of black feminism. The work is still a dad saying, reminded us that if we're going to talk about race, we have to think about it intersectionally. Race, class, gender, human sexuality, and also different positions that black and brown people take in terms of understanding how racism works. And we cannot do what the Labour Party are trying to do at this moment in time, which is to fold everything into class. Big mistake. Sorry, Trevor Phillips, if you're listening. Big mistake in terms of folding it all into class, because it's much more complex. Another question we're asked to consider is the question of how then do we go about building global solidarity? And again, I wanted to go back in order to go forwards, because I'm a child of the 1970s. Remember the anti-apartheid movement being one of the few movements that linked global South politics to the North, not only in terms of theory, but in terms of practice, in terms of organizing, in terms of thinking about racialized oppression. And there was that great moment in the early 90s when Nelson Mandela came to Britain as a consequence of this global struggle, this global solidarity, to then support anti-racism in Britain. And it was one of the few moments where this connection had been made by people in the global South. Often folk come, including the folk doing reparations, we've spoken to them about this, and just have one issue in mind, but don't necessarily join up the dots, so they understand that you can't talk about decolonization without dealing with issues around racialized oppression within the domestic context in Britain. So global solidarity matters, but we need to join up the dots more effectively for this to happen. You can't talk about discrimination in the South and not deal with discrimination at home in our workplaces. Look, black women have been saying this for the longest time. Since the 1970s, Angela Davis and God bless her, Audre Lorde before, were writing about black struggle in America and connected with the Palestinian struggle. And recognizing that there's an interconnection between these issues around subordination, around land theft, on disinheriting people, systems of racialized oppression impacting on them. So again, there's a lot of material that we can draw on in the background to make sense of our current predicament. Why is there no public attention? Well, our African scholars tell us that it's about necropolitics. We still, in the West, have a politics of death. When we look at the African continent, we still have a lens which sees it as not civilized, not as organized, chaotic, and therefore we have to control it. Just think of the way in which even today in Parliament a question was raised criticising Keir Starmer, which had a lot of negative racialized imagery and tropes around Africa within it. If you listen to Question Time, very boring life listening to Prime Minister's Question Time in the afternoon. So we've still got to overcome that, and that's something I think is still a question in the aid sector as well in terms of necropolitics. So what do we learn from these racial justice movements worldwide that can be useful for today? Well, since 1965 and the Immigration Act, I think the organisation that does best in connecting up the dots globally, nationally, across every sector, and in terms of gender, race, class, global south, global north, apart from, obviously, our good friends Oxfam, is Stop the Mangamese, the work of Esther Oseonu and others who've been doing this work for the last 20 years, trying to make global connections to build global solidarity. We may come and may talk about them a bit later on as well. What do we do after empire then? After the afterlife of empire. I think we're working with Xavier Hartman's concept of the afterlife of slavery there. What are some of the key things that we need to be concerned with? I'm worried because my children's generation are all Afro-pessimists. They don't believe racism is going to end. So that doesn't necessarily mean they're pessimistic. They're very optimistic, raised by me. They're very optimistic children. And Afro-pessimism isn't about being pessimistic. It's recognizing that some structures are not going to disappear. Therefore, you have to organize effectively around them. Black joy tradition is one of the traditions that come out of Afro-pessimism. Also, fugitivity, the idea that you may need to practice freedom, but freedom as escape from systems of oppression. So I'm quite worried in terms of where where the millennials and others are going in terms of thinking about what kind of solidarity, because many are saying we may need to opt out. For me, I think one way forward for this is maybe if we go back to thinking about places and spaces where we were able to bring diverse peoples, communities, class, is together. Was in the old workers' institutes. They phased out very late in the north of England. I know you got rid of them very quickly in the south. It's a working class kind of a different kind of context here. We had these fantastic worker institutes. When I first started teaching back in the early 1990s, I used to teach in one. And we brought together working class, black, white, Asian, people racialized in those ways, communities to talk about politics, to talk about development, what was happening in the local community, to build collective solidarity. In fact, it was so good, I moved it to the prison. For 2 years, I taught in Birmingham prison, working with offenders, doing exactly the same thing, building solidarity by getting men to think about the political context of their criminal experience. Worked with some, about 80% got better. The research showed 20% got worse, but that's a whole other thing in terms of prison education. Thank you.
Hello. Thank you so much, Robert. You've given us so much there. So much on the evolutions of racism, how immigration continues to be a structural barrier, why we cannot afford to situate it all into class instead of race, and so much more that I'm sure will come out in the questioning. We're going to weave from the groundings of the evolution of racism into how these forces play out today in our politics and our policy making. And we're handing over to Dr. Dayo Eseonu, who is a lecturer in politics and policy at Lancaster University, whose work advances racial justice through inclusive policy making. Her research explores how racially minoritized communities can shape governance using critical race theory and creative methods. She founded the Racial Equity and Policy Network, connecting UK policymakers committed to racial equality, and also serves as a trustee for Involve. Over to you, Dr. Dayo.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming this evening, and thank you to Joe and Rhea for inviting me. So I don't have a PowerPoint, but I have notes to help me kind of speak coherently, if I can say that. So I think Professor Beckford's discussion of history is quite a useful starting point because we can start to see similar patterns in history that have been kind of repeated now. So I'm going to start, maybe not as far back as you did, but in the 1970s, Stuart Hall wrote a powerful essay on the Great Moving Rights Show. And this was at the time where there was a racializing of economic anxieties, there was a scapegoating of the other. All of this sounds quite familiar because we're seeing that currently now. So the 1970s was sort of Thatcher came in, we're plagued by low wages, housing crisis, poverty increased. So all of these issues, it's like we're talking about 2025. And so people were angry, people were grieving. So Amara Spence wrote a fantastic blog about that white working class people are grieving their economic losses, but they're looking to the other as the scapegoat, as the reason to why what's happening to them is happening now. Politicians, the media are all kind of stoking this narrative about it's their fault, this scarcity mentality. I've heard kind of black elders say it feels like we're back into square one with kind of the recent riots that have been going on, back to a time that was characterized by overt racism. And I think for a while in the UK, many liberals were convinced that we were in this post-race society, that race doesn't matter. People will say that George Floyd's name has been invoked so many times as to kind of this racially awakening. And at the time when, I guess, race was said to not matter anymore, these microaggressions, so the micro is not as in the small impact, but the everyday nature of racism became quite difficult to sort of point out and quite difficult to kind of prove. And Sarah Ahmed talks about if you did try to sort of say, I'm experiencing racism, you became the problem. And so I think Dr. Cohen-Sanchez just released a paper on this idea of polite racism, and I thought that was very British. It's a very British thing, where she talks about this idea of bureaucratic neutrality, and I write about it a lot, where these sort of neutral rules of bureaucracy of, I'm just following the policy. I can't, make different decisions because this is just how it is. We see sort of talks and rhetoric of diversity with that redistribution of power, of resources, or colorblind rules. It's not about race, but it's race neutral, but actually they have very real outcomes in terms of how that's experienced by racially minoritized groups. So all these things to say that expressions of racism may have evolved but the racial inequalities that racially minoritized groups experience have typically remained the same in all policy areas. You can look at statistics from, 70s, 80s, and look at it now, and there's very kind of little progress with that. Instead, what we're seeing is this pitting of race and class against each other. And I guess within kind of the policy, Stuart Hall Foundation released a report a couple of years ago to say that over the last, I think since the first Race Relations Act, there have been so many government-sponsored inquiries, over 600 recommendations, I think 586 recommendations of things to do to that would sort of support achieving racial justice, and hardly any of those things have been achieved. And I think part of that is a political choice. It's a choice to kick things down the road. So within the policy space, to talk about wicked problems, we talk about it's too difficult too difficult to address. So, one thing we can do to kind of buy time is to set up an inquiry, to set up a commission, to all of these delaying tactics, basically to not address, because we have the evidence. We have the evidence. The evidence has been stacked up for years, but nothing's changing. And at the heart of it, it's the lack of political bravery, if you like, I don't want to say political will, because that's just too easy, but just, lack of political bravery to actually, and working with policymakers, any kind of attempts to center racial equity, it's like, that's a political move. And there's that fear, again, this idea of bureaucratic neutrality, that if we're seen to be doing things related to racial justice, it becomes almost like political suicide. And I think at the heart of all this, one of the reasons of racial inequalities, or persistence of racial inequalities, is this idea of institutional racism. And academics will say that's quite a big word. But I think for me, if we were to unpack it, it would be looking at how rules, practices, and narratives are racialized. So how do they perpetuate exclusions, inferiorization, subordination, and to really kind of unpack the more general racism to more specific in these contexts. How can we understand? Please let me know how I'm doing with time, because I can talk for ages. And I think in talking about racialization, I also want to be clear that the racialization is not just perpetuated by white people. Whiteness means that black and brown people in positions of power can also be active in the marginalization of black and brown people. We can see that in conservative government, but I will not go into that, or even current government ministers, but anyway. And the silence that we, I quite like. I'm going to take a picture of the board outside. So the radio silence on Sudan and the DRC, I think, and you already talked about it, can be seen through kind of the lens of necropolitics. Racialization puts black people at the bottom of a hierarchy of whose lives has value. So that's what racialization does. Necropolitics then means that state-sanctioned violence, either through direct action, so state-sanctioned explorations and exploitations of resources, or neglect, or inaction. It's like whose life is seen to matter, and whose life is prioritized as needing, not saving in terms of white saviorism, but in terms of whose life matters and where should the money be sort of moved towards. And this leads me then to reflect on global solidarity. So we here in the UK, in the diaspora, and I think what you talked about, we were talking about actually global solidarity works two ways. And that was an interesting thing for me, because I think when I was writing this, I thought mostly of solidarity from the north to the south. And I was thinking, as we in the diaspora here in the UK, we're in the imperial core, and as part of that, there's discomfort in terms of our complicity within kind of where we're positioned in the global north. And I think that shouldn't kind of lead to paralysis or guilt or fragility or anything like that, but to think about and move us to action. And Kehinde Andrew talks about, or writes about, being black is black as being a country, and to think about how racism functions beyond nation states. That slavery and colonialism were transnational genocides and transnational in the way that it worked. And so resistance also needs to be transnational efforts to undo the legacies wherever we find it. And so the question, there was a question of, so can Britain offer lessons to the rest of the world? Possibly. I think compared to some of the other European countries, for example, that don't have a history of legislation, such as the Race Relations Act, we can share lessons, just like what Professor Beckford's presentation shows. So I'm not going to talk too much about how communities and activism and policy kind of galvanized to start us on this Race Relations Acts and journey. But I think, the famous words of the tools of the master's house can't dismantle. So I think there's a limit, because if the legislation was all we needed, then racial inequalities would be kind of a thing of the past. So I think that's a lesson to learn about how do we then excavate these racialized rules, practices, and narratives in the way that characterizes how do we so for example, a narrative in global development, in particular around kind of, countries needing saving and things like that. So finally, so I'm coming to the end of my spiel. In excavating these racialized practices and narratives, I think we can resist through joyful forms of cultural expression, of accessing the voice of color, which is a critical race theory tenet, and is the idea that people who are racialized in particular ways can speak about their own experiences that no one else has access to. And I do a lot of work, I write about Afrofuturism and I work with Afrofuturism, so similar to kind of the Sankofa idea of looking back to understand the present and reimagining the future where there is black freedom. And so we can choose to resist through various art forms. We can tap into our imagination that aren't, I guess, anchored in. And imagination is actually, it can be a luxury, particularly when you are in deep poverty, dealing with issues of, just the day-to-day, trying to get through life. So imagination is so key, because when we imagine, we can dream of freedoms and practice freedoms that we want to see. And so I'm reminded of Matulino, who was talking about in the context of African philosophy, but I think works here, is what would blackness look like in and of its own right? So without always in justification to whiteness, or in comparison to whiteness. Would we see more music? Our stories would look different, artwork, textiles. And I guess my final reflection to end with is, as NGOs, INGOs, activists, even academics like myself, who are keen to see more or move towards more equitable anti-colonial global partnerships, how can we operate in a freedom that would operate as if whiteness either never mattered or never existed?
Thank you so much, Dr. Dayo. You, again, also gave us so much there. I was really moved by what you said about solidarity needing to be two ways, and I feel just how compromised some of us feel to be able to actually put that down, and what a lot of what we've seen over the last 2 years, but more just the fact that it's in and of itself an expression of white supremacy and saviorism to not. All right, okay, so we are moving from the policy space into the power of the story. The voices that shape public understanding and also collective memory. We are handing over to Taj Ali, who is a British journalist, historian, and racial justice advocate known for amplifying working class and South Asian voices. Formerly an editor at Tribune, he now co-leads Radar, an independent anti-racism organization, and his upcoming book, Come What May, We're Here to Stay, documents South Asian resistance in Britain. Over to you, Taj.
Thank you. Last year marked the worst racist rioting in living memory. Mosques were targeted, shops were looted, people of colour were attacked, particularly in the northeast of England, in Merseyside, in areas where the black and Asian communities were smaller and more geographically isolated. I spent that week reporting on what was happening up and down the country. I barely got a wink of sleep, and some of the stories I heard from people were missing shifts from work. There was a woman having panic attacks in her home. There were people who've moved home since those riots because they feel unsafe in those communities. And that is the impact of racism in the here and now, because the atmosphere of hate that drove that racist rioting has not disappeared. Many of us heard these stories over the summer with the so-called Raise the Colours campaign. There was an increase in racist hate crime. The Peacehaven Mosque in East Sussex was firebombed. The graves of Muslim children in Watford was desecrated. There are many, many stories of people being abused on public transport, horrific sexual assaults of Sikh women in the black country. I'm sure some of you have heard these stories. A 9-year-old black girl in Bristol shot with an air gun. These are horrific stories in 2024 and 2025. And for my father, it reminded him of the 70s and 80s, where there were certain roads in my hometown, Luton, that you couldn't walk through if you were black or Asian, because you'd get your head kicked in by racist thugs. Even when my father was at school, teachers would make racist remarks. They would poke fun at the black and Asian kids. When you were racially abused and attacked on the street, the police wouldn't help you. That was the reality on the ground. If you speak to older black and Asian people, they'll tell you these stories. Many of them were on the receiving end of police brutality as well. So why do I walk comfortably through some of those streets in Luton today? Was it the Race Relations Act of 65? Was it government suddenly gaining a consciousness and saying racism's bad? Was it something that came from Westminster? No. It was because people in communities like mine organized in the 70s and 80s to confront racism. And that's the first thing I want to say, that we cannot out-legislate racism. It's not going to come from the state. It's not going to come from above. It's going to come from our own communities. And it's a constant battle that we face. Unfortunately, we have to also understand how racism has changed since the 70s and 80s, because now they have new tools in their arsenal. They have TV channels. They have social media, misinformation. They have billionaires and even trillionaires sharing their content. And they have unfortunately created hate factories. People are being radicalized in real time. Where did the riots take place? 7 in 10 of the most deprived areas of Britain saw racist riots last year. Many of these communities have a lack of social infrastructure. They've lost their industries. There's many people in those communities who are angry, and they're right to be angry. You're right to be angry that you've lost your public services, you've lost your industries, you've lost your sense of community. But we're angry as well as people of colour. We are disproportionately working class, but we're never considered left behind. We're never considered the traditional working class. Even though many of our elders worked in the factories, the mills and the foundries, even though many of our people are responsible for actually reconstructing this country after the Second World War. But beyond any of those contributions, beyond the history of colonialism, we shouldn't have to be exceptional to be treated with basic dignity and respect. So as much as I'm deeply angry about all of these racist incidents and these individuals attacking people on the street, racism is also a question about power. Because it's very easy for politicians and journalists to say it was all misinformation, it was all Tommy Robinson, it was that incident that people misunderstood. No. People in positions of power have fanned the flames of bigotry for many, many years, and now they're acting shocked that the fire spread. Now they're acting like it's a surprise. It's not a surprise to many of our communities. So there's been 2 moral panics in the last few years. One of them is the moral panic around Palestine solidarity. If you cast your minds back to November 2023, you had these huge marches and demonstrations in solidarity with the Palestinian people in Gaza. The second moral panic is the way we talk about asylum seekers in this country. We're talking about global solidarity today. Nobody wants to talk about where they come from. Nobody wants to talk about the wars, which our own government have been complicit in many occasions. No one wants to talk about the legacies of empire and colonialism. And people in Britain are unfamiliar with that history. They're unfamiliar with the history of empire, that this country colonized a quarter of the planet. A quarter of the planet. And actually, in some of these areas where you've seen anti-migrant sentiment, there aren't actually that many migrants. But the dehumanization of migrants and people of color has meant that even one black or Asian person, be they a migrant or not, is seen as a threat. This is a very, very dangerous narrative. And as a journalist, I spent a lot of time in many of these far-right Facebook groups, Telegram groups, just to get a sense of what people were saying. There was an awful lot of nostalgia that we used to be this great nation, that we never had slums in East London in the 70s. It was lovely. It was lovely before the Bangladeshis came. You know, that's the language, that's the thing that people say. And actually, anyone who's familiar with the history of a place like East London knows that the scars of the Blitz were still visible. Many of these people moved out. They had social mobility. They moved out to the nice suburbs. But there is that concept of grievance, that we've been pushed out of our own communities. Nobody wants to talk about white flight. Nobody wants to talk about the fact that black and Asian people disproportionately resided in the poorest inner city areas, suffered housing discrimination, were forced to congregate together because of racist violence. And that's why we have the multicultural communities that we have today. So understanding history is very, very important in explaining the present. Robert Jenrick recently visited Handsworth. He visited Soho Road. He described it as a slum. He said he never saw a white person. Soho Road. That same Soho Road in 1984 during the miners' strike, the mining lodges used to fight over who would get that patch when it came to fundraising, because this poor black and Asian community were raising a lot of money for predominantly white miners because they had this understanding of class solidarity. White people were taking money from poor black and Asian communities to feed their kids in 1984 from Handsworth. Who remembers that history? Who is taught that history of solidarity? So as much as we talk about global solidarity, there is also a history of national solidarity, uniting people around shared material concerns. Because at the end of the day, we all want a roof over our heads, we all want food on the table, we all want money in our pockets, we all want safer streets. And when I think about some of those areas that saw riots last year, Hartlepool, Hull, Sunderland, Great Yarmouth, Clacton, they have high levels of poverty. And the argument I've always made is, well, they're not that different to places like Luton, like Bradford, like Brixton, like Birmingham. They actually have the same material concerns. And so the task ahead is to actually try and unite communities on that shared vision of improving our lives without shying away from calling out racism, without shying away from addressing the narratives that are coming from the top. And I want to end with some stories of hope. I was in Sarajevo about 6 weeks ago in the airport, and my flight was delayed. And there were some Plymouth fans. They'd come and sat down in the cafe. They'd had a few drinks. One of them had an England tattoo on his arm. So I had an image in my head of, what his politics might be. And they started talking to me, and we're talking about the football. We got on. And then one of them said to me, "This burqa thing, mate, what do you think of it?" And he was almost just waiting for my reaction to see if I'm offended. I said, "I'm not offended. I'm glad you asked the question." And I explained what the burqa is. We had a really good conversation about my mum's experience growing up in Luton in the 80s and 90s and the racism she faced. And they'd never really interacted with black or Asian people. They'd never really spoken to a Muslim. It just so happens that my sister, who wears the headscarf, was around, and they had a really nice conversation with her. A week later, Plymouth played Luton Town at home. The local mosque was giving out refreshments. And just that one conversation, I think made a big difference. I think there's a lot of people with concerns and questions, and the only information they're getting at the moment is through a very racist media landscape, through very racist politicians. So we do need to figure out where the spaces are where we can have these conversations, because I think it's really important that we differentiate between a dyed-in-the-wool fascist, a violent racist, who you do need to defend your community from, and someone who is being brainwashed by their narratives. And too often I've seen this as a journalist. I've spoken to people, and it's really interesting when you talk to them. They'll say things like, you know, I don't mind migrants, but it's the small boat people, they're a threat. Or, you know, I don't mind people of color, but those Muslims, they don't integrate. And it's things they've heard online, it's things they've discussed in a pub with other people, but they've never really had the conversation. You know, the mosques, the gurdwaras, the churches, they're all open. Anyone can come in there and have a conversation and discuss various things. But I think all of our communities need to do more to facilitate those spaces, and sometimes that means having those difficult conversations. I also think, and we discussed this earlier, that the media is based on clickbait, it's sensationalism sells. It's all about extremist voices. You don't see acts of kindness. We were talking earlier about a woman being helped by people from various different backgrounds on public transport. That's a very common thing that we all see in our communities, in multicultural communities. Nobody highlights those stories. And so I do believe that the majority of people in this country do not subscribe to the views of people like Tommy Robinson. But what we currently fail to do is organize. The late and great Malcolm X said, we are not outnumbered, we are out-organized. And I think the next few years will be determined by that very simple question: who's better organized, us or them?
Thank you so much, Taj. That was a really, really powerful account of the history of race, poverty, and class, the somewhat lack of safety in institutions of power, and also, of course, the importance of what it means to be organized within our own communities. We are heading to our last panelist now, which is over to Jean McLean. We're looking, I guess, and we've built on throughout the narrative arc that's been built so far of how we look to expressions of hope throughout some of these really challenging conversations. So Jean is the Director of Engagement for the Green Economy Coalition at the IIED. She works to amplify underrepresented voices in global climate and economic policy, ensuring that equity and lived experience are central to the green transition narratives. Her work bridges grass movements and international platforms, challenging systemic inequalities and promoting solidarity across communities. Over to you, Jean.
Thank you so much, and a big thank you to Oxfam for creating this space. I'm just going to start with a little note, which is that I'm of the sector, and so if I do make criticisms, I'm absolutely talking about myself and the work that I've done in other organisations, so please do hold me accountable. But as you started, I guess I'm bringing a real perspective that is like, it just sees the interconnection between anti-racism, between gender justice, between climate justice, and I guess I want to just bring that perspective, I think, to this conversation, but very much by starting to say that when I introduce the work that I do, I say I work on green and fair economies, and people are always like, well, what do you mean by fair? And I mean, what I mean is equity, but we can't use that word equity because inequality and the discussions around that scare off funders and also lead to debates about what is credible and what is possible. So I take the option of avoiding that and talking about fairness, which is something that we can all get behind. And while I do that because I think it's really important to have a broad church, to be inclusive, and because of something that Taj talked about, which is the fundamentals of power, if we're going to generate change, we need to be really clear about where our power is coming from. And I guess what I and what the speakers here have spoken about today is about solidarity, it is about people power, and it's about unity and what brings us together as opposed to what divides us. But recognizing there is a diversity experience and we have to be careful about how we hold that diversity. And so that's the perspective I'm bringing, but really to underpin that under all of that is a foundation of this idea of scarcity, is this concept that the world is zero sum. For some people to win, other people have to lose. that there is a logic or design architecture, because this is not just about words and narratives, though they are so important. Like, our economies and societies are constructed on this idea that people will be like there's a hierarchy, and some people will win and some people will lose. And I think it's that logic that we really need to challenge in how we do our work, how we speak about it, and going beyond our language. We just need to recognize the extraction that's happened, the exploitation, the destitution, and as Rhea started, like, talking about who bears the brunt of these policies, who's at the sharp end, and where are those people. And so I, like everyone else, thinks that acting in solidarity abroad requires acting in solidarity at home. And when I was first started in the sector, I'd always have people who'd say to me, but charity begins at home, Jean. And I'd be like, well, that may be true for some people, but it doesn't end there for everyone. And I think charity is the wrong way to frame it, and it's not necessarily about sympathy or it's about those values that we want to chirp into, but it's about like empathy. And I think like that basis of empathy is how we build solidarity, and that starts with trust, and it starts with connection, and it starts with community building. So some of those things that Taj has talked about, but also the other speakers too. And so I guess this focus on what unites us, and that we have more in common that unites us than disorganizes, is really important. And from an international perspective, INGOs have normally talked about human rights. Like, that's a really convenient vehicle to say we're all humans. Like, we don't say we're humans, we talk about human rights. And I think it's just to recognize at an international level that's like a really Western concept, and like it's not fashionable now, it's not in vogue. Like at the UN, people are talking about economic rights, and it speaks to this point about deprivation and grievance. And it's like, as a sector and as someone who's worked on change, we haven't got the right policies yet. The solutions that we're offering are not solutions that are making a difference to people's livelihoods, and we need to do better. We need to do better when it comes to the policies, we need to do better when it comes to the messaging, and we need to do better at exposing how the far right are working. And they're talking about a golden age of the past, which is not a black experience. It's a specific history about looking backwards, which is eliminating and is silencing the experience of other people. And so we need to be a bit sharper about that. But it's not just about, I think, focusing on, I guess the plea I'd make is not just about focusing on who has the burden or who is at the sharpest end, but it's really talking explicitly about who is benefiting. And I think like it is about an architectural logic that is constructed, and that's what we need to be focused on, like exposing. That's what we need to get better articulating and visibilizing it. So there is people who are benefiting, and like we know who they are. They're tech oligarchs, they're the tech bros, they're the fossil fuel interests, they're far-right politicians, and the thing that unites them all is money. Money's been flowing into like podcasts, into various media platforms, into GB News, The Telegraph. Like, we've come in a week where the BBC is under attack from the far right, but there's nothing to be seen from the other side, you know, trying to create that counterbalance. So there is an organization here, and there's like a really important funding that's happening about how these ideas are disseminated and distributed. And we need to get our game. We need to get better messages, better messengers, and we also need to be investing in creating these spaces and not ceding them to the right. And just to recognize that they, together, that, like, I don't know, that cabal, we need a better word for these baddies, the far right we'll use for this, but like, it's their agenda that's now our agenda. It's their agenda that most people are, like, experiencing. They're the ones who are setting the news. They're telling us what's important, and there is silencing what we really care about. And it's that silencing that's really critical because it dampens action. It stops you from building the momentum that is like social proof that that builds those movement moments and that unites and binds people together. So we need to get better at telling those stories about, people on buses and the day-to-day experiences that we have and the humanity that connects us. And I think, I could go on about this, but I think just looking at climate and immigration is probably the best example of stories that get silenced and amplified and how that works. So, we can see that across hundreds of countries, there's so much support for climate ambition, but that's on the stories that we're seeing, that's very much silenced. Instead, we're talking about immigration, which, as you said, is speaks to this attention economy. It's outrageous. It's driven by hatred, it's fear and chaos, and that's what the likes of Elon Musk are trying to export to us. It is about fear, and it's about, again, it's scarcity. It's like you losing, and it's not about what unites us and brings us together. And so it's just this recognition that there is a playing field, but that playing field is asymmetric, and we need to get serious about how we level that off and think about what that looks like and what it means. And I guess to try and inject some hope here, it's like we've taken on vested interests before. Like the tobacco industry is one that's been regulated and curtailed. Trade unions want us a weekend, you know, like some of us are moving to 4-day weeks, like change is possible. And like the civil rights movements, I think, is probably like the greatest example of this. And I think that's probably where I want to focus a bit more, is like change. And I think as a sector, we're probably focused a bit much on like policy winning strategies rather than power building strategies. And that's what we need to really think about and start to get surgical about. Is we need to like recognize it's no longer just about ideas and evidence and data and research. Like that's a persuasion game. We're not in a persuasion game. If we're transforming societies and if we're building solidarity, then that is a pressure game. And that means like making some people very uncomfortable, but it's also about creating some comfort and some space for like non-traditional allies to sit together and to work together. And so I feel like at heart is we need to really address the cancel culture that has really promoted, I think, progressive spaces, like these ideological purity tests, and we need to be serious about thinking about how do we pull people together, how do we have those conversations with an open heart and an open mind, how do we forge those connections, how do we build communities, and how are we serious about building the constituencies that we need to overturn the vested interests which are like driving us down a path of like authoritarianism. And I guess in conclusion, like it's not, I don't think about ideas anymore. I think it's about building a solidarity infrastructure. We need to be serious about thinking about the long term. Like I say, be a bit more heritage foundation. Where's our project 2035? Like where's our planning? Like how are we investing? How are we safeguarding? And how are we supporting and creating that safety that we need? And lastly, you know, we could talk about messages and like policy and all of this all day long, but I think what I've heard from the panel today is like the real importance about narrative and culture. And I guess we're on a playing field, and the playing field either enables authoritarianism to take root or solidarity. We've all got a role in that. And I guess I'm really excited to hear about what people's ideas are and not to neglect those things. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jean, walking us through some of the limitations and also the challenges that we experience within the sector. And something to what you were saying around the policies and strategies really spoke to something that Dayo had also mentioned on what are some of the deflection tactics that actually prevent us from being able to speak truth into narrative and culture.